candy. I can think of much better things for you to be doing with your hands.
Hello and welcome to another bad movie review. This time we're talking about Friday the 13th Part 3. This is from 1982 and it was directed by Stephen Miner. Now, film buffs will recognize Stephen Miner's name from several other films. Just in the horror genre, you've got House, Friday the 13th Part 2, Warlock, which is one of my personal favorites, and a whole bunch of other stuff. He's got quite the record. Now, this one focuses on a woman named Chris, played by Dana Kimmell, who was also in Lone Wolf McQuade and some soap operas. Very active actress, especially in the TV scene. She had some sort of previous encounter with Jason where he tried to abduct her, but she kind of blacked out on what exactly happened when he grabbed her. So we never really get resolution on that. And for a very long period of the film, you don't actually see Jason's face. He does get the iconic hockey mask in this one, but we also see his face and he's got the deformity going on, but it's not as prevalent in the film. Most of the time he is just seen from like neck down until he gets the hockey mask. And he actually gets the hockey mask from one of the characters in the movie. So I counted 11 kills, but only one boob scene in here with 2 side boobs. Unfortunately, there is a 5-minute recap of the previous film, which if you didn't see part 2, it spoils the ending for you. But this does pick up very quickly after part 2 ended. And this does not take place at Camp Crystal Lake. This is just a cabin on the lake with a barn for some reason. One of the main selling points of this though was that it was in 3D, and they do a lot of pointless, unnecessary 3D scenes, like somebody moving an object. There's a really dippy scene where one of the characters sees a snake jump out, and the snake is obviously on a fishing line. It is just ludicrously bad. Now the first kill in here is done with an actor named Steve Susskind. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2005. Very prolific TV actor as well. Most of the people in this were prolific TV actors. Pretty solid actor, actually. And this was only his second part in his acting career. He's a little old to be starting an acting career, I think, but hey, it worked for him. But he gets killed in a pretty ludicrous way, but all along the way, we've got these fake jump scares with him and his wife. And unfortunately, that ends up being a theme throughout the film, where there's mostly false jump scares and suspenseful music playing for them to try and trick you into being afraid at nothing. And sadly, that's very apparent through the entire film, that most things are going to be jump scares. Now, Richard Brooker plays Jason in this one, and he does a pretty good job. If for some reason it looks like Jason's hunchback in this, I don't know if Mr. Brooker had a physical deformity or what. I couldn't find any pictures of him without makeup, and I didn't really care. But weird here is that Richard Brooker also directed more than 40 episodes of Bill Nye the Science Guy, so there could have been a crossover there, but unfortunately we were cheated out of that. Interestingly, he was also a trapeze artist, so that didn't really come into play in the movie. I just thought it was pretty cool. But anyway, so Jason is going around killing these kids that are just there for the weekend, supposed to be having a good time, and he's doing it fairly stealthily. Unfortunately, there's one kill that is off screen. I counted it anyway, but it was kind of cheap. Some of the dialogue in here is really bad too. About the first half of the film has some really rigid dialogue. So I don't know if that's the fault of the screenwriters, but it was a little amateur hour on the dialogue. Some of the acting is a little bit rigid too, but you could tell there's a few of the actors that this is very early on in their career. And I don't really hold that against them too much because it is a B movie. For a rated R film though, this was pretty tepid. Like I said, there were a lot of phony jump scares, and the 3D was obviously done as a gimmick. Now, there are 2 versions of this. The one in 3D, which you should definitely watch just because you get a better understanding of how ludicrous the 3D was. And there is a non-3D version, but if you watch the non-3D version carefully, you can see weird discolorations around the corners of things, around edge lines. It's especially noticeable in the upper section of the film, where you'll get like little hints of blue and red that look like the film is really cheap. But that's the 3D effect being washed out. And I think it does lose something by not being in 3D, because although it was done as a gimmick, it really does add a certain amount of cheese to it that you're kind of missing out on if you just watch the 2D version. I know there were a couple of versions on DVD and Blu-ray that did have both on them, and they usually came with 3D glasses. 3D glasses, they were the blue and red ones from the 80s. They're pretty easy to find online in bulk for $5-6, so you should be able to order some if you manage to find a copy but without the glasses. And although it is a gimmick, like I said, it does add a little bit to the film to kind of experience it that way, as well as watching it the regular cinematic way, but I think the 3D actually adds to the fun of it. So unfortunately, this one is pretty disappointing in many regards. We don't see Jason fully for most of the movie, I would say, and when we do see him without his mask on, he looks more like Sloth from the Goonies, and he's just deformed looking, but he does get the iconic hockey mask. Unfortunately, while the kill count is pretty high at 11, the boob factor is way low, so it really doesn't even it out very well, so it doesn't really live up to the theme of like a jiggle fest where it's just about people drinking and doing drugs. There is drug use in this, but it's a bunch of stereotypical stoners. The characters in here were a little thin compared to some of the later films too. They're really not as fleshed out as they probably could have been. The characters you kind of get attached to die pretty quickly, so there's that. But it was interesting to see how Jason got the hockey mask, and it's really kind of disappointing at the same time because it's just a prop somebody else was using for a cheap scare. But there was a really good scene that in the 3D is the harpoon being shot into someone's eye, and that one was way better than the knitting needle. So it really is kind of a mixed bag. Most of the 3D effects were lazy and obviously done as a gimmick, but it still has a certain amount of nostalgia for me because it adds to the cheesiness of it, and you're just sitting there thinking, this is so ludicrously silly, why are they doing this? There was also an eyeball popping scene that really didn't need to happen. It was so obviously fake. The head is clearly a prop and the eyeball is just over the top, which is kind of the theme of this film, is that it's just consistently going a little over the top all the time. It gets better at the end of the movie where it sort of turns into a more traditional slasher flick, but the majority of this film is sort of a paint by numbers of over the top sequences that the franchise has a stereotype of, and I think a lot of those stereotypes for the franchise come from this movie because the acting is a little over the top for a lot of the actors. The special effects are pretty weak for most of the film. You can see the string on the snake, and the kills are kind of tepid overall. They're not bad, but they're not as stand out as some of the other films, and those should have more 3D effects, but you end up with people just moving random objects or passing things or general everyday things that shouldn't be thought of as like being wow 3D. They're the ones that are getting played up instead of the stuff like swinging the machete or somebody getting jabbed with something. It's just very ludicrous 3D effects for most of the film. So while this movie absolutely did not need 3D, since it has it, you should watch it with 3D. And honestly, I think this is one of the weakest films in the franchise, simply because of the lazy 3D additions that didn't need to be there, and the 5 minutes from the previous film being glued on to pad the runtime. But the direction looks good, the shots are fantastic, so the cinematography is good. There's some recognizable people in here that you've probably seen from some 80s and 90s movies and TV shows. So there is that. You can play a lot of 6 Degrees with Kevin Bacon on this film, but you have to really know your movies for that. So I'd have a hard time actually recommending a priority on this film. I think it's a little too weak and it really just belongs in a marathon. It may not be the worst, but it's absolutely not one I'm going to run to if I'm going to show somebody a Friday the 13th film. But that's going to do it for this one. Thank you so much for listening and supporting the channel. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future reviews. And as always, we hope to see you on the next one.